What I hope to do tonight is to talk a little bit about where we are today with the science, what we understand about the dangers. It's much different from what we understood a year ago, and it will be much different from what we understand 6 months from now. So what I'd like to do first, to give you some context for what I'm going to be talking about, is to direct your attention to the two screens. I bet you thought that was just psychedelic film. Well, actually, what that is animation of the life of a cell. And while you're listening to me today, that stuff is going to actually occur hundreds of thousands of times in each of your bodies. Now, a couple of things I would like to point out. And the first is that when everything is working right, the body is an enormously beautiful machine. But when things are not working right, we have disease. And there are a couple of things here that I would like to have you focus on and remember so that I can refer to them during the talk. Okay, these things here, those are microtubules. See those little connections between those two cells? Those are microtubules. And when everything is working right in a cell, you have two types of communication that occurs between cells. And as Alfred eloquently mentioned this afternoon, you have cells that communicate and talk to each other. And when they talk to each other and work together, they form a tissue. And when you have tissues that talk together and work together, you have organs. And when you have organs and tissues that talk together and work together, you have an organism. And we as human beings are an organism. And it is all based on the ability of cells to be able to communicate with each other. Now, these two different types of communication between cells involve microtubules and gap junctions. Now, microtubule communication is instantaneous energy communication. It occurs at the speed of light. That's why when you stub your toe in the night, you feel it instantaneously. That is because there is instantaneous speed of light energy communication going through microtubules from your toe to your brain and back to your toe instantaneously. So microtubule communication is the energy communication. Now, when things work properly, what happens is that the microtubule communication occurs first. And it tells the surrounding cells that something needs to be done working together. Something needs to be done. The microtubule communication is instantaneous, and the something that needs to be done is communicated through something called gap junctions. And that communication is chemical, and it's slower, and it's the big job communication. So microtubule communication occurs first, and then the big job gap junction communication occurs second. Now, you can turn that off now. Subtle energy interventions operate at the microtubule level. They operate at the microtubule level. So that what Alfred was talking about earlier today with the energy resonance technology, the target is microtubule communication. And when things are working right, if microtubule communication is efficient, then gap junction communication follows behind it. So if you handle microtubule communication, now you're handling everything that follows. That's when everything is working correctly. The difficulty is that with energy systems that go from cells through tissues, through organisms, the biofield, and you have external energies that compete or interfere, things are not going to be working properly. Now, over the past 20 years, scientists from around the world have studied very precisely what happens in the electromagnetic spectrum in terms of mechanisms of harm to organisms like human beings. It turns out that all electromagnetic radiation is not created equal. There are at least 3 different effect windows that operate through different mechanisms. One effect window has to do with extremely low frequency radiation, the type of radiation that comes from electric power lines, the type of radiation that you have in leakage in your home. And the mechanism of harm there is direct magnetic influence. At the other end of the spectrum, you have another window that occurs with ionizing radiation, X-rays and gamma rays. The mechanism there is high energy breaking of chemical bonds, so that in the ionizing radiation part of the spectrum, there's so much energy that it can directly break DNA and other chemical bonds. Now, because we have understood those 2 effect windows for almost 100 years, the assumption was made that radio frequency radiation was going to operate through the same mechanisms. That is why in the early 1980s, when cell phones were first introduced in Europe in 1981, in the United States in 1984, they were exempted from pre-market safety testing. And the reason was because the industry convinced the government regulatory authorities that the mechanisms of harm from radio frequency radiation were direct magnetic or ionizing. And based on that, cell phones and subsequent wireless technology went into the marketplace never having been tested for safety. Never having been tested for safety. Now, in the ensuing years, everything was fine with that decision until Larry King Live ran a show with a fellow by the name of David Reynard, whose wife had died of a brain tumor, and she was pregnant. And during her pregnancy, he bought her a cell phone. And her surgeon, David Perlmutter, believed that the tumor was related to her cell phone use, because the tumor was a very unusual tumor called a neural epithelial tumor. It was a type of tumor that started on the outside of the head and grew inward. He had never seen one of those before. So that he went on the Larry King Live show with her X-rays and showed that the pattern of her tumor was the pattern of where the antenna from the cell phone was. Now, the next day, Motorola stock went down by a few points.